Hey guys. This is part 3 of What If Naruto and Sasuke became friends a few years early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 8. A cut to Zabuza's left arm had drastically cut down on its functions a while ago, and he was fairly sure his right arm didn't have that long either. He barely dodged one of the ninja hound's teeth, trying to counterattack and banish it, but was intercepted by another, nearly having his arm ripped off as it bit down. He wrenched it off with all his might, backstepping several times as he created distance between him and the dogs. He was losing, and pretty badly at that. He'd underestimated the man in front of him. The hero of the sharingan was far stronger than the assassin had thought he'd be. And I heard Haku scream earlier. He had been trying to break away from this fight to help his student for a few minutes now, but Kakashi was nothing if not persistent. It didn't help Zabuza that the man's summons were ruthless, easily keeping up with him at his top speeds, and able to track him by his scent when he disappeared into the mist. From what he'd seen, he couldn't even kill them either. They'd disappeared into puffs of smoke after he hit them, and after he'd banished a few of them, Kakashi had simply summoned them again. He was just about to exhaust his last contingency when he heard the roar. He'd never experienced anything quite like it, a piercing, wailing sound that seemed to split the very air. It launched Kakashi's dogs back several feet, and even briefly stunned both of the jonin. When Zabuza looked back towards his student's position, it was to see that the fog had been cleared out from the area. Well, that's not good. He could clearly see his student's Kekkai Genkai, which meant that Haku was, thankfully, still alive. They obviously hadn't been able to test it, but they had both theorized that the ice would melt were Haku to be killed. Unfortunately, it seemed that roar had come from dead center in the middle of the mirrors. An orange chakra, that seemed to radiate evil around it, filled the air, nearly suffocating Zabuza even from so far away. He dreaded to think what that much power must have been doing to his own student, and so, resigned to the fact that he was about to be getting much more than he bargained for today, ran backwards into the raging storm. Haku was in pain in quite a lot of ways, not the least of which was the stab wound directly beneath his sternum. It also didn't help that he'd killed one of the only people he thought was nice in the entire world. He hadn't known Naruto very long, and in fact their interaction hadn't been a particularly long-winded one. They talked philosophy while Haku was gathering herbs for Zabuza's recovery. He himself had said that he lived for his master. Whatever the man's intentions, he would always fight for him, and serve him. Naruto had actually reflected his own philosophy. The boy had said that no matter what, at the end of the day, the only thing he really cared about were his friends. Well, it had been that, and becoming the Hokage, which Haku imagined was probably the least equivalent to the Mizukage. It was a big dream, but he thought it fit the boy quite nicely. And then he'd shown just how committed he was to his friends, taking the kunai meant for the black-haired boy with his own body. He hadn't been about to kill either of them, merely incapacitate them until his master could finish the leader off and assassinate the bridge builder. At the same time, he could understand how the blonde boy had been unable to read the attack, thus assuming it a fatal blow. He had nearly cried himself, watching the boy he just met die in his friend's arms. Still, he had had a job to do. Zabuza had been clear about one's emotions, they should never be shown on the battlefield, and so he'd been determined to finish the job, to knock the other boy out despite his feelings, and assist his master. And then Naruto had gotten up. It had been incredibly sudden, stunning Haku to the point where he'd nearly been killed by the boy he was fighting, having to form an icy dagger in his off hand to deflect the kunai the boy wielded. And then Naruto had roared. It was far more powerful than anything he'd ever felt in his life. It had hit him with enough force to stop his assault, forcing him back into his own mirrors. The boy below him, the one with black hair and the glowing red eyes, had run over to his friend, looking ready to embrace the boy. And he'd almost been killed for it, just barely managing to dodge the charging beast that dashed by him, crashing into one of Haku's mirrors as it failed to stop its own momentum. His eyes widened as the ice shattered instantly. Sasuke didn't really know what to feel. On the one hand, Naruto seemed to be fully recovered, sprinting around the arena, and completely destroying their opponent's hidden jutsu. That was certainly an improvement from when they'd been trapped inside a veritable hell of Saban. On the other hand, Sasuke was fairly sure the boy was trying to kill him. It was quite clear that something was wrong with his friend, but he had no idea how to approach the situation at all. What's going on? Sasuke turned around, shocked at the sudden intrusion into his headspace, to find the masked boy they'd been fighting poking his head out of one of his mirrors. He couldn't see his expression, but figured the boy was just as shocked as he was. No idea! And why the hell are you asking me? Shouldn't you be trying to kill me? No offense towards you, but I think that thing is going to kill you far faster than I will. Sasuke grumbled quietly to himself but couldn't find a rebuttal. Yes, so? The boy hesitated. Haku. Sasuke thought, that's going from bad to worse. Zabuza Momochi, the demon of the mist, charged forward, swinging his blade in a simplistic arc at Naruto. His friend, if he was even there anymore, didn't bother to dodge. The edge didn't pierce the boy's skin, instead simply knocking the creature back a few meters, landing on all fours with a hissing growl. The hell is up with this kid? The assassin spoke, looking towards Sasuke like he'd have some magical answer. Do I look like I know what's going on? Sasuke thought angrily, fists clenching on his weapons, which he hadn't so much as lowered from the two in front of him. My best friend's turned into some kind of monster. Do you honestly expect me to? Sasuke. This time, it was his backup, as 4 or 5 ninja hounds came pouncing onto the scene, forming a protective unit around him. His sensei took the space beside him a second later, eyes hard as he looked from their assailants towards Naruto. Shit, Sasuke, what happened to Naruto? Their teacher sounded more serious than he had ever heard him before, looking towards him with his sharingan blazing. The masked guy was about to kill me. He noticed the boy, whose name Zabuza had said was Haku, flinched slightly at the accusation. But Naruto stepped in front of the kunai instead, and I thought he died, but... Right, I've got it. Kakashi interrupted, looking appraisingly at the boy in front of them all, who was growling back and forth with the ninja hounds, seemingly in some sort of primal standoff. Sasuke, what I'm about to tell you is technically classified. In reality, it's an open secret that most of the adults in the Leaf Village know. His sensei turned towards him. Naruto Uzumaki is the Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed fox. Huh. After being fatally wounded, I'm assuming that his body was searching for anything it could find to save him, and ended up taking in some of the nine-tails chakra. He seems to have absorbed far more than should be possible. His seal was supposed to be secure. Wait. What? And why are you saying all of this in earshot of us? Zabuza spoke up, drawing his massive blade onto his shoulder, and looking at them suspiciously. The identity of the nine-tailed fox's Jinchuriki could be valuable information to the right people. Because right now, I don't even know if Naruto's going to survive this. Sasuke's face blanched, and his heart skipped a beat. He'd barely been able to follow the past few minutes between the two, going back and forth between themselves, seemingly both sizing each other up and threatening one another all at once. But... wait, why wouldn't he survive? Didn't the nine-tails chakra or whatever revive him? Kakashi looked at him with a gentle expression, before his eyes widened, and he pulled him backwards. Just in time, as a chakra claw cut into the space he'd previously occupied, rending the very air with a wave of heat that hit Sasuke's face a second later. The 4 of them dodged backwards, barely managing to avoid a few more attacks from the nine-tailed Naruto. Go, Kakashi! One of the ninja hounds, a small, reddish-brown dog, yelled out to his mentor, stepping in front of them with his entourage in tow. We'll distract this guy, though we've only got a few minutes left before the summon ends. That's fine, Pakin, Kakashi spoke to the dog, practically carrying Sasuke backwards as they ran away from the creature. Thank you for your help. No worries, but you'd better buy us some of the good treats after this. The dogs all pounced at once, dragging the form of Naruto to the floor. Just for a moment, Sasuke feared that they'd rip the boy apart, but he saw a second later that their teeth weren't even penetrating the thick, evil chakra that surrounded his body. After Kakashi had created some distance, he created a few hand signs, and then brought his hands down onto the floor. Earth-style, mud wall. A great barrier, that seemed to be made out of something other than the bridge they stood on, came into being in front of them, blocking one of the Jinchuriki's next attacks. Sasuke. Kakashi looked back at him, sighed, and then continued. The Nine-Tails plan would most likely be to take over Naruto's body fully, and then reconstitute himself in it. His goal here is for Naruto to lose himself, gain all 9 of his tails, and fully summon himself into the outside world. Well then what the hell do we do? Can't we save him? Sasuke was aware his voice came out desperate, pleading even. He didn't particularly care. This was his friend's life on the line, the boy's life that he'd given for him. Right now, his own didn't matter. He'd give anything, everything, to save his friend. To pay back the debt he Naruto. Kakashi was silent for a few seconds, contemplating something as the wall in front of them shook and began to give under the Nine-Tails' assault. A second later the noises stopped again, replaced by the scraping, scratching, and growling of the dog's attacks. The far easier plan is to eliminate the threat in front of us. The Nine-Tails may make Naruto strong, but that's only brute strength. You've seen that, right, Sasuke? The boy had tried to kill him a few times, but they'd been instinctive moves, poorly thought out, easily dodged. But I would be able to kill him, even in that form. Sasuke didn't even hesitate. What's the other plan? The man in front of him simply sighed, seemingly resigned to his fate, before he placed his hands in front of his sharingan, making a modified tiger sign. The man closed his eyes, concentrating hard. In the days of the Warring States period, it was rumored that an Uchiha of immense power, a man known as Madara, once tamed the nine-tailed fox with only his sharingan's genjutsu. Kakashi spoke calmly, but there was something in his voice that caused the hairs on the back of Sasuke's neck to stand up. Doubt. I possess a powerful type of sharingan, known as the Manjikyu Sharingan. That sent a chill down Sasuke's spine. He'd heard about the Manjikyu from his brother, and that the only method of obtaining it was to kill your closest friend. He wasn't sure whether or not to take his brother at his word, but he had nothing else to go on. Okay, so then you're going to cast a genjutsu on Naruto to break him out of this? I know a few genjutsu, but the problem is that Madara never really left a guidebook on how to subvert the Nine-Tails' will. Hell, even the whole taming thing is just a story. His sensei wasn't looking too good, his legs were shaking slightly, and he was paling. It doesn't help that I've only ever used my Manjikyu a handful of times. I'll need plenty of time to charge it. Does that mean you'd be buying me time, fighting against Naruto? Kakashi looked straight at him, eyes hard. You'd have no real backup, no one coming to save you, all on your own, against the nine-tailed fox's Jinchuriki. To say the thought scared Sasuke would have been an understatement. He was terrified, and physically shook in place, bracing himself on the ground with his still fully functioning right arm. His left arm was dull and numb from repeated attacks from the boy sitting across from them, looking down at the ground in silent thought. He wouldn't be alone. All heads turned behind them, and Sasuke nearly shouted out as he looked upon the visage of Sakura, stood there with a determined expression on her face, kunai at the ready. Sakura, why aren't you guarding Tsunami's? Kakashi spoke out, looking towards the girl with minor shock. I was, and then 2 mercenary guys showed up, wanting to kidnap her. I took them out and tied them up, gave them to the villagers, but they left to go and form a militia. I think they're going to try and protect the bridge. Sakura explained, laying out the events of the last hour or so. The bigger question is what the hell's going on here? I mean, I heard the ending part about the Manjikyu Sharingan or whatever, but what is it we're fighting? 'Cause it doesn't seem to be those two. She pointed to Zabuza and Haku, who were resting against the opposite side of the bridge, with the older man wrapping a bandage around his student's wounded sternum. Sasuke almost wanted to feel bad about that, but then remembered that this whole thing was his fault, and that he'd been trying to kill them both. Not feeling all that bad about that. Sasuke and Kakashi gave the girl a brief rundown on what had happened, and on their objective, to try and distract Naruto while their sensei charged up his manjiki to use a genjutsu. Wait, hold on, Sakura spoke up when they finished, looking terribly worried. Do you even know the jutsu to break him out of this? Their sensei gave them a shrill, non-committal laugh. Oh my god! Sakura muttered, kneeling down on the stone bridge, breathing heavily, eyes hardening every second. A moment or two later, she looked up, terribly afraid. We're going to fight that thing, she gestured at the wall, which, as if on cue, shook terrifyingly under the strain of Naruto's attack. On what might as well be a fairy tale. It's that or kill Naruto. Sasuke spoke up, speaking with none of his usual delicacy. Doesn't she understand that we have no options here? Sakura bit her lip, looking away from him. It was, indeed, hard to weigh your entire life, the lives of your friends, and the lives of an entire village, on what was essentially a giant hunch. But for Naruto, Sasuke would do it. Please, Sakura. The girl sighed before she stood up, looking towards him, and nodded. All right. Kakashi looked at the two of them with his right eye with what he could only describe as awe. That or intense worry, it was somewhere in between. The man trailed off, seemingly lost on what could possibly be said in such a situation. Instead, he simply shook his head, and looked back towards the stone wall, at the very least prepared. Good luck, you two. They nodded, and a second later, the wall shot forwards. It was shrinking as it did, seeming to lose mass as it pushed the raging beast on the other side of them towards the end of the bridge. It flung the creature off the end of the incomplete section, and both the muddy earth and the beast crashed into the waves below. A second later, the one-tailed Naruto leapt back onto the bridge, eyes primal, filled with nothing but rage. There were only a few meters, perhaps 4 or 5, between Sasuke and Sakura, and Kakashi, Zabuza, and Haku. A few of the ninja hounds Kakashi had summoned, those left on the other side of the wall to distract the Ninetales, were still around, though they looked to be running out of steam themselves. Sorry kids, that's all we can do for ya. Couple of my boys were already banished, I gotta go check up on them. The leader of the group, Pakin, if he recalled correctly, spoke out, eyes guilty as he looked upon the two of them. That's fine, thank you for everything. Sasuke spoke back, giving the canines a weak smile. The dogs burst into smoke a moment later, all wearing that same expression of guilt. Uchiha didn't much care, he hadn't been counting on them to win them this fight. Hell, he'd been planning on doing it alone until Sakura showed up. What's the plan, Sasuke? The girl in question looked towards him but didn't dare turn away from the threat in front of them, who appeared to still be sizing them up. Don't die. Sasuke didn't turn his gaze away from the beast in Naruto's body. He could feel something in the back of his skull, a faint tingling there. It clawed and itched, begging to be let free. Well, Sasuke thought, I see no reason not to. His vision heightened to a ridiculous state, so much so that he could see the individual movements of Naruto's body, could tell that the boy's seemingly skittish jolts were actually pain jittering. Could see that the aggressive look in his eyes was actually agony, a cry for help. He felt himself grow angry, truly angry, for the second time that day. So, this nine-tailed fox thinks it can just take my best friend away? Sasuke seethed, drawing one of his last 2 shuriken into his weakened left hand. Use him for its own means? Sasuke saw the exact moment when the creature charged, the movements in its ankle beginning to propel it forward. He was already dodging the attack before the beast even realized it was attacking. I won't let you! Sakura fell slightly behind, barely managing to sidestep the monster's claws, but inadvertently gave it a clear path towards Kakashi. The both of their eyes widened, as the man in front of them became the target for the Ninetales' wrath. Or he would have, if not for the masked boy from earlier kicking Naruto aside, standing to step in front of Kakashi. Haku! The assassin of the mist cried out, eyes wide with shock. What the hell are you doing? Zabuza, sir, the boy replied, juking past another swipe by a hair's breadth, the chakra on the beast's claws coming close enough still leave a cut on the masked ninja's skin. I thought I killed this boy once already today, and found myself overcome with grief. I tried to hide it, to bury it like you said to, but. The boy dodged underneath a claw and sent a rising kick to the underside of the Ninetales' jaw, launching the creature back towards him and Sakura. I am sorry, Zabuza, sir, but I do not think I could kill him again. The masked boy shook, and even from where Sasuke was stood, it was obvious the boy was crying, however much he tried to hide it. The demon of the mist seemed frozen to the spot, unable to find anything to say, but a second or so later, the Ninetales landed back onto the bridge, and shot past the two remaining members of Team 7, gunning towards Haku with all its rage. It was intercepted by a massive great sword and buffeted back by the sheer force of the swing. Haku, you! Zabuza Momochi seemed at a loss for words, sighing a second later, before swinging his sword back onto his shoulder and reaching down to briefly ruffle the boy's hair. The man turned back towards the beast, now between Team 7 and the two of them, and raised his sword. I think we need to have a long talk after all of this is over. To his surprise, the boy reached up and removed his mask, storing it away inside of his haori. The boy smiled a bit sadly, not quite able to meet his master's eyes. That sounds good, Zabuza, sir. Sasuke got his first good look at the boy's face, and he could say with fair certainty that he hadn't expected him to be quite so feminine. Still, he'd also seen the boy stab his best friend today, along with trying to murder an innocent bridge builder for money, so he wasn't so foolish as to think that made him less intimidating. I'm about 40% of the way charged, Kakashi spoke up, looking up at Zabuza and Haku with some slight trepidation, before dismissing it. If you guys really do want to help, well, we could use it. Want to help is a strong term, Zabuza spoke up, rolling his eyes as he forced his left hand to rise. Sasuke noticed that there was a large incision on that arm, likely given to him by their sensei. Still, he managed to bring his hand forth, and instantly, 2 copies of Zabuza, made from the water surrounding the bridge, sprung into life. I'm here because this brat asked me to be, there's no other reason. If this thing we're fighting ever threatens Haku's life, then I'll kill it without a second thought. The boy in question seemed stunned, eyes widening as he looked up at the famed demon of the mist. Zabuza, sir? Like I said, we'll talk later, brat. We've got work to do. The assassin's clones went first, dashing towards the one-tailed Naruto with impressive speed, using their momentum to swing their blades with even greater force than normal. The beast took the blades on with its body, clinging to them after they hit, and drawing the clones towards him by their own swords. It cut them down a second later, much to the assassin's chagrin. Even still, the mist duo didn't stop moving for a second, as Haku had already brought out a small collection of icy blades, hovering behind him in the air, and launching them towards their opponent. Sasuke stood back, letting the two work in tandem without getting in their way. After their attack was over, he would intercede with his and Sakura's own, and allow the other two to cool down. After all, this wasn't a battle they needed to win, they only needed to outlast their opponent. If they were still standing when Kakashi had fully charged his Manjikyu, then they would be victorious. Saying it is a lot easier than doing it, though. Naruto growled fiercely as he took the spiny icicles onto his arms, not piercing his bubbling chakra layer, but unable to move forwards whilst being pelted continuously. The beast ducked a moment later, practically prone on the ground as it avoided the remaining daggers, dashing forwards in an inhuman way. Zabuza stepped forwards, kicking the beast straight in its face, knocking it backwards as the demon of the mist looked towards Sakura and Sasuke, nodding towards them. Our turn, then. Let's go, Sakura. I'm here. He slid across the cold stone beneath him, kicking up at the disoriented Naruto with his left foot, using his right hand as a pivot to spin in midair, connecting a second kick to the side of the boy's jaw. The beast ground its teeth together, trying to reach out and take Sasuke's leg, but was interrupted by a shuriken straight to the hand, with pinpoint accuracy, thrown by Sakura, who stood just a meter or two away. The creature turned towards the source of distraction, but was this time met with a scorching ball of flame to the backside, Sasuke using about half of his remaining chakra for that attack. He didn't have much in the tank to begin with, still exhausted from fighting Haku earlier. Naruto flew backwards, once again pushed to the edge of the bridge. He growled, sizing them up, but not making a move. This is going surprisingly well. Sakura spoke up, smiling despite the situation. Why would you say that? A second later, the beast before them fell to the ground, clutching its head. It squirmed and yelled, as a protrusion around its backside began to grow outwards. A second tail joined the first. Why would you say that? Sasuke screamed out, exasperated. I don't know. His teammate screamed back, looking desperately back at Kakashi, who was still charging up his jutsu. Sensei, how much longer? I'm at around 60%, give me 2 more minutes. The man shouted, impressively managing to keep his concentration even with Sakura's shouting. Sasuke wasn't quite sure if they could manage 2 minutes. As far as he'd seen, Naruto wasn't taking any damage, not that they were really trying to inflict it either. Still, it meant that even though they could knock him out of the fight for a moment, he'd always come back. And now, he was dashing back towards them. Sasuke threw his shuriken, but the beast merely took the hit, ignoring it and swiping his nails towards Sakura. They were blocked by Zabuza's blade, but the man was knocked backwards from the force of the blow. Which was bad, because they'd been staying even in the fight through the assassin's brute strength, and if he couldn't hold the 9 tails, then none of them could. Sasuke wouldn't lie, he was panicking a bit. Not for him, the sharingan meant he saw all of Naruto's moves a second before the boy even started to make them, but it couldn't protect Sakura, or even the 2 people fighting with them. Right now, the balance of the 4 of them versus the 9 tails was being held, but without wanting to kill the boy, it was all they could do to hold that balance. And the beast before them had no qualms at all with killing them. Sasuke drew his last shuriken, turning it in his hand aimlessly, trying to distract himself from what lay before him. It didn't really work. The creature let out a short roar, briefly stunning all 4 of them, before it charged in recklessly, aiming straight at Zabuza. It couldn't quite connect the hit, as Haku deflected the 9 tails' outstretched hand, causing him to strike only air. The assassin didn't miss his window, chopping the boy with full force on the back of the neck. It should have knocked the monster out, but instead, it merely rocketed him into the ground. Upon landing, the creature didn't hesitate, it simply spun in place. The monster's tails swept Sasuke's feet out from under him, and he realized with horrified panic that he was falling, and that the monster was going right for him. It was hard to describe what happened to him next. It was as if, all of a sudden, the entirety of his life flashed before his eyes. His family, his friends, their deaths. It all came to him. What stuck with him, really, was his brother. The man's accursed eyes came back to him in that moment, glowing not with rage or passion, but with boredom. I need to kill him. It was a simple thought, filled with the feelings his brother was unable to possess, unable to understand. He'd mocked Sasuke that night, all that time ago, to build up his hate, his grudge, and to seek him out when their eyes were the same. How the hell would he kill him now, though? The 9 tails was about to run its claws through his chest, killing him before he could even cry out for help. Another thought, a single, oddly confident thought, came to him. I want to live. No, that wasn't quite right. I need to live. That thought, no matter how straightforward, how primal in nature, made his eyes respond. He sent an idea to them. Make this beast stop. They complied. Pain. That was the first thing he felt. A coursing, sharp pain inside of his skull. The beast before him halted, seemingly held in place by invisible force. It vibrated slightly, as if dreaming fitfully, but whatever it was in Sasuke's sharingan that kept it from moving didn't falter. It's asleep? It didn't make the pain any lesser, however, and Sasuke fell to his knees a second later. He didn't look away, though, couldn't afford to. The 9 tails' chakra claws were only an inch from his face. Pain. A horrid wave cut into skull, and he thought for a moment that the beast had carved into him. His head felt like it was going to collapse in on itself. He fell to the floor, completely spent, and the 9 tails above him awoke, raising its claws once again to deliver a final blow. A second later, a massive cleaver struck the monster's side, launching him across the bridge, where he landed in a heap, howling in rage. The hell, kid! Zabuza scooped him up with one arm, handing him over to who he could only assume was Sakura. You didn't say you knew genjutsu. Didn't. It was hard to speak, it felt like his mouth was filled to the brim with syrup. Didn't know. I could. The assassin gave him an odd look, but it was soon replaced by an exhausted grimace as the monster at the end of the bridge roared once more, and the man stood back up to full height, drawing his weapon back in front of him. Sasuke hadn't seen when, but the weapon had cracked straight down the middle. It wasn't quite broken, but he imagined it didn't have long. "Or copy ninja," Zabuza shouted out. "How much longer?" "I'm nearly ready," Kakashi yelled back, head hung low, but with a determined expression on his features. "I need around 30 more seconds." The demon hissed, but complied, charging forward. Going on the offensive was probably the easiest way of keeping the beast off of Kakashi, but Sasuke could see at least one problem with that plan. Namely, that the beast in front of them had gained another tail. It was faster too, it seemed, as it darted past Zabuza, running straight at Haku. The ice user flinched but managed to bring his arms up in front of him in time to block the strike. It didn't help him much with the landing though, as he skidded to a stop a few meters away, having been launched across the bridge. He didn't seem to be getting up, but was certainly alive, if the pained groaning was anything to go by. Zabuza growled, and brought a kunai out of his pouch, pouncing on the beast from behind and slamming it down. He managed to score a small cut onto Naruto's back, even through the chakra, though when he pulled his left hand out, it was to find it oddly marked, almost as if it had been burned. "I need 15 more seconds," Kakashi called out, standing up for the first time in minutes, preparing to cast his jutsu. It wasn't much, but it brought some life back into Sasuke's features. He could feel Sakura, who was still holding him in her arms, rouse as well. They both rose, rushing in to join the fight. Until Sasuke's legs gave out on him, that was. "Sasuke!" His teammate called out behind him, sounding horribly concerned. "Help them, I'll be fine." It wouldn't do for her to worry about him now, not when they were so close. Sakura complied, running into the melee in front of the two of them, connecting her kunai with one of the boy's swinging tails, just barely managing to duck underneath of his claws. 5 seconds. Sasuke watched it all in morbid fascination. At any moment, any of those three fighting Naruto could be killed. A single hit to a vital area could kill them. This was that intense of a battle. 4. The Nine Tails charged at Haku's still body but was intercepted by Zabuza's cleaver. The hit was enough to break the blade in twain, sending the second piece flying off the edge of the bridge. 3. Sakura brought her hands together, muttering something, before bringing her hands down onto the ground, and shouting Earth-style, "Mud wall!" Whether she'd picked it up off of Kakashi's technique earlier, or she had known it beforehand, one couldn't deny that Sakura had chosen the perfect time to use her jutsu. It was smaller than Kakashi's, and a bit less well-packed, but it still took a potentially dangerous hit for the demon of the mist, breaking upon contact with the Nine-Tails' claws. 2. The nine-tailed fox, though some strange instinct, or perhaps actual intelligence, seemed to realize what it was they were trying to do, to seal it back away, and charged towards Kakashi. It dodged one blow from Zabuza, juked underneath another from Sakura, and even effortlessly broke apart the earth wall the girls spawned in front of it. 1. Ah, there's that feeling again. Naruto's face smiled, knowing it had won, claws poised to take the head off of their mentor. Off of his own mentor. His hand stopped an inch from the man's face. Pain. It hurt quite a bit, but that wouldn't stop him now. He could hold the beast, he knew that. He'd done it earlier. He didn't have to manage it for very long, just a second. Just 1 second. Manjikyu Sharingan! Kakashi screamed, left eye finally revealing itself. It was bloodshot, and the design of the eye had changed, now a swirling pattern reminiscent of a windmill. It was as if all noise in the area died for just a moment. All of them, even the two from the mist, sat silently, waiting to see if their ace in the hole had come through. A second later, the nine-tailed fox let out a piercing howl, buffeting them all back. It scratched at the bridge below it, carving out giant chunks of the solid concrete as if it were made of butter. One tail left, then two. Finally, the third tail disappeared, and as the beast let out one final yell, it stilled, mouth still open towards the sky, trapped in a perpetual scream. Sasuke wanted to collapse. Honestly, he probably needed to collapse, but that could wait. Right now, he needed to know if the boy in front of him, his best friend, was alright. The boy's body fell to the ground, completely limp. Kakashi was the first to him, being only a meter from him at the time of his collapse. He cradled Naruto in his arms, bringing his head up. Sasuke noticed that the man's left eye was leaking blood, running down his face where it dripped onto the blonde's face below him. Sasuke felt terrified to ask, but also couldn't stop himself. Is he? Kakashi looked up at him, and then, to Sasuke's immense relief, gave him an easy smile. He's alive. Sasuke gave a small noise of acknowledgement. He looked over at everyone around, walking over to them in varying states of exhaustion, and nodded to himself. His legs gave out a second later. Sakura felt an odd sense of loneliness as she looked at her two teammates passed out next to one another. Of course, she wasn't lonely because they were passed out, but more because of what had happened today. They'd both given everything they'd had. They'd given blood, sweat, and tears, and what had she done? Sat around a house, Sakura mentally grumbled, idly spinning a kunai on one finger. Capturing some random mooks. Oh sure, she'd been able to bring out her new jutsu, the mud wall, which Kakashi had taught her while they waited around on the bridge. It turned out that her primary release was Earth-type, so he decided to show her one of his favorites. She appreciated it, honestly, and apparently she took to learning new jutsu quite well. It felt like empty praise, even if it maybe wasn't. What had it all mattered? When Naruto's clone had shown up, they'd both agreed Sasuke was better for going to back the boy up, and so Sakura had waited behind. Behind them, like she always was. It didn't matter that she'd successfully protected those two at the house. Didn't matter that maybe her efforts would lead to the bridge getting rebuilt. None of it mattered. Well, maybe it did, but not to her. As she ground her teeth, thinking about this and that, she nearly missed the sound of someone clearing their throat in front of her. She looked up and was surprised to see the icy ninja that they just fought with. Hello? The boy spoke out, smiling a bit sadly to her as he sat down, cross-legged, on the bridge. It's... Sakura struggled to come up with a name. She'd heard it once while being stressed about Naruto, but she thought she could remember something that sounded vaguely correct. Haku, right? Indeed. The boy's smile became a bit more genuine, before he gazed down at the floor, drawing a small design in the rubble with his finger. I don't really know how to say this. I find it's almost always easier to just come out with it. Sakura spoke, not looking at him, but instead at the two jonin a ways away, talking quietly to one another. It turned out that working together to not die made friends of the weirdest people. Kakashi was currently trying to reason with Zabuza about dropping his and Haku's current job. It seemed to be going well-ish. Oh, alright then. The boy in front of her squared his shoulders and stood back up to his full height. He bowed deeply, the front of his haori might as well have touched the floor. I'm sorry for nearly killing your teammate. Oh. I actually didn't expect that. Thanks. The boy shuffled awkwardly for a moment or two, fiddled once with his robe, and then walked over to stand next to his master. The sound of marching footsteps caught Sakura's attention, and she turned to the source of the noise with a curious expression. She saw 40 or 50 men, all armed with swords or similar weapons, charging their ways up the bridge, laughing and jeering. They came to a stop a ways away from their group, though every single one of them had already drawn a weapon, some a bit more subtly than others. Kakashi had a shuriken in the back of his left hand, concealed behind his leg. Zabuza had simply chosen to place his broken sword over his shoulder, holding it ominously. Sakura saw more than a few men in the crowd shuffle nervously, though that all changed when a shrill voice sounded above them. Well. A small man, barely a meter in height, stepped in front of the rowdy band, smirking to himself like he was the beneficiary of some lucrative scheme, which he probably was. What do we have here? Enemies consorting with one another? People under my payroll, actively betraying me? Gato looked back towards his men, laughing. All of them followed suit, though it wasn't hard to notice that half of them had to fake it. You know, the last person who did that is currently tied to a boulder, about a mile deep in the ocean. If it was possible, Sakura thought the man's smile grew even more heinous. He smacked his cane against the concrete bridge, the sound echoing off the water. Men, he spoke shrilly, pointing his cane out in front of him. Kill them all. The band shouted, but before they could so much as make a move, an icy dagger pierced directly into the shoulder of one of the frontmost mercenaries. The man screamed as he fell, landing on the ground in a heap. He'd live, but he was out of the fight. Haku himself looked unfazed, summoning more daggers from behind him. This is the last of my chakra, Zabuza, sir. The boy spoke quietly enough that the crowd couldn't hear him, looking oddly confident despite their situation. That's fine. Thanks, brat. The assassin brought his left hand in front of him, and even if it was badly burned from the Nine-Tails chakra, he was still able to form the signs for water style, water clone jutsu. A few more Zabuzas, perhaps 6 or 7, sprung up beside the man, each of them swinging their swords around them in an arc, and then slamming them into the bridge below them. Even with only half a blade, the concrete still cracked under the blow. The men in front of them were stepping backwards now, actively frightened of pursuing their targets. Sakura's sensei looked to want to join in as well, and the man raised his hand in Naruto's trademark shadow clone jutsu sign, but he faltered. She could see the strain playing on the man's face and realized with a start that he'd just used a more powerful sharingan, merely days after he'd recovered from using the less powerful version. He had to be barely standing, most likely knowing that if he fell, the men would charge. Sakura swallowed nothing at all, trying to keep herself calm. She put on her best brave face, and took a battle-ready stance, drawing her last kunai from her pack as she feigned preparedness. The men looked to be nearly fully cowed now, looking backwards and seeing if they couldn't make a run for it. "The hell are you doing?" Their boss, Gato, shouted a second later, eyes roaming over the group of men. He drew his cane out and whacked the man on the floor, who had been stabbed by Haku's icy projectile earlier. "Get up! Get up!" The man in question did manage to stand up, but only did so to take a step backwards, completely ignoring the angry man in front of him, and instead focusing on the 4 presumably battle-ready ninjas in front of him. I have to admit, Sakura thought, smiling with more confidence than she really felt. This whole bluff thing isn't a bad plan. They needed one last push, though, all of them could see that. The men were skittish but looked to still be grappling with the idea of losing their paychecks for the foreseeable future. Luckily, it seemed Zabuza would be giving them all the motivation they needed. His clones drew their swords back, and with more strength than Sakura had ever seen, hurled their blades towards the crowds. They parted like a river, yelling desperately as they narrowly avoided the spinning blades, which cut deeply into the concrete where they landed, eventually melting back into the water that they were. Sakura imagined that, had they seen them turn into water, these people wouldn't have been nearly as afraid. Unfortunately for them, however, they weren't really looking behind them very much at all, on account of running away with their tails between their legs. They halted again, however, as an arrow impacted the ground just before them. He was a small archer, barely shorter than Gato, and wielding a crossbow far too big for him, but Einari still managed to cut a mean figure. It probably helped that he had a good 100 people behind him, all armed with what Sakura imagined was whatever they could find. She saw kitchen knives, frying pans, and even one particularly enthusiastic woman with a soup ladle. What the hell?" one of Gato's mercenaries called out, taking a step back, and bumping into another equally as frightened man. Trapped on all sides. What do we do?" "The bridge. Jump off the bridge." "Yeah." The first to go was a swordsman, then a man wielding a glaive. The rest followed suit, jumping off the bridge in varying states of panic. Zabuza, however, shot forward, apparently unsatisfied with how things had ended up. He charged into the crowd, and Sakura heard a faint scream, before he emerged, carrying a small businessman over his shoulder, looking awfully pleased with himself. "Well, hello there, Gato." The assassin spoke up, and Sakura could tell even with the bandages that covered his face that he was smiling maliciously. "I actually have a question for you. My ears were damaged during my fight earlier, so I couldn't quite make out what you said. The man in question paled, his face going whiter than the clouds above them, looking for all the world a corpse. Sakura feared he might soon become one. Would you mind repeating it for me? Gato let out a small squeak, and then fainted in the man's arms. The demon of the mist snorted, taking the man by the back of his collar, and hauling him up, once more holding him behind his shoulder. He swung his sword around and placed it onto his back as well. It still fit in the holster he'd made for it, the blade cracking below where it connected into it. Well, Zabuza spoke up, looking to be in a notably better mood than he was earlier. He reached his hand into the man's back pocket and pulled out a wallet that looked fit to burst. I'd say that worked out surprisingly well. Despite everything that had happened, Sakura found herself giggling slightly into her hand, and then full on laughing a second later. She laughed for a long, long time, even as she heard her teacher give a small chuckle as well, before he looked over to the two who'd worked with them today, eyes hardening. Now, what to do about all of this? Kakashi spoke up, before he sighed a second later, putting away the shuriken that he'd been holding this entire time. Humph! Zabuza himself gave a small laugh, though it was muted. We know about that boy, and the secret he carries. The demon of the mist looked at the both of them, looking for the first time since Sakura met the man like he deserved that moniker. You can't let us go. No, Kakashi spoke, gazing down at the floor, placing his right hand into his pocket. I can't. There was silence, and for a brief moment, Sakura thought they were about to fight these two again, in the state they were in. Even she knew they wouldn't be winning that. To her relief, Kakashi looked back up, smiling in a way that could be seen even from underneath his mask. So, I'd like to invite you two to come to the Leaf Village. What? A second of looking around at everyone, who all stared back at her, made Sakura realize that it had been her who had screeched that out. She squirmed a little under the scrutiny, but still couldn't quite hide her shock. Just like that. I can't help but agree with the girl, Zabuza spoke up, expression a bit curious. I can't help but think that it'd be far too easy for us to kill the four of you and be done with all this. Plus, I'd get to make a pretty penny off your bingo book entry, too. It was Kakashi's turn to laugh this time, as he looked towards the man student, who looked to be paling slightly at the notion of killing their new friends. I don't think you would. What? The assassin spoke up, surprised by the idea that Kakashi would think him incapable of murder. I said I don't think you would, or at least, I don't think your student would let you. Zabuza looked down at his protégé, who couldn't quite meet the man's eyes. And what makes you think that this brat here calls the shots? He does what I say. Kakashi snorted. Doesn't seem like it to me. What? The demon of the mist sounded like a broken record, but even Sakura could see that her teacher's words were having an effect on the man. Is he blushing? I think you like that boy quite a bit more than you let on, and I think you know he thinks the world of you. Kakashi spoke, leaning back against the railing of the bridge. It seemed like a casual position, a show of trust, but Sakura could see the truth, that the man just couldn't stand up anymore in his condition. I'm just thinking that perhaps life in a village would be far easier than that of a mercenary. Zabuza blinked, thought about everything that was happening, and then blinked again. He made a small noise that seemed to Sakura to be the start of a retort, but it died before it could make it out of the man's mouth. To add to that, you won't be hunted by the mist tracking unit if you enter the Leaf Village. Our barrier core is one of the strongest in the world. You also wouldn't have to worry about money, being able to make it from missions and the like. Kakashi. You. The assassin seemed caught between anger and contemplation. He was rapidly changing the focus of his gaze, from his student to her sensei, even looking to her once or twice. And I think your kid there would appreciate not having to kill his new friends, am I right? He gestured towards the boy to speak, though if he expected to get a word out of him, he was clearly mistaken. The ice user clammed up completely, his fact paling. Zabuza looked down at his student, seeming to be thinking about 500,000 things. He brought his hand up, almost wanting to place his hand on the boy's shoulder but decided against it at the last moment. Haku, what do you want to do? The ice user looked up at his master, bewildered by the question. If Sakura had to guess, she'd say that the boy didn't usually have agency in these things. Zabuza, sir? The man simply nodded towards his student, but otherwise not speaking as the boy looked down towards the ground, eyes a complicated mess of feelings. Haku spoke quietly, rubbing his hands together nervously, before, with a deep breath, he steeled himself. I don't want to hurt these people. The demon of the mist looked down at his student, seemingly indifferent to the boy's decision. A second later, he brought his hand up onto the boy's head, and lightly ruffled his hair. All right, I guess that's what we'll do then. Zabuza turned back towards Kakashi, sighed deeply, and then smiled tiredly. Well, you heard him. I suppose this makes us. Kakashi fell sideways, slumping down onto the ground, and somehow managing to land just next to Sasuke and Naruto. All three of them passed out from exertion. The assassin looked confused, as did Haku. They seemed a bit concerned as well, and Sakura felt that was fair. This wasn't the first time she'd seen this happen, though. Hell, it was the third time this week. Still, though, as she looked down at her comatose teammates, she realized with a pained groan that someone had to carry them back to Tazuna's place. Sakura spoke, falling to her knees and massaging her face with her hands. Why me? Chapter 9. Naruto awoke, with a start, bumping his head against the windowsill above him, and groaning into his hands. It felt appropriate, given that just about every part of his body hurt. It wasn't quite as bad as it had been. He could vaguely remember the intense, searing pain he'd experienced. The worst of it was clearly behind him, as he was already feeling better, but he still had to wince as he thought about it. Especially since he didn't really know what happened. The last thing I can remember, Naruto thought, scratching his chin, is that evil-looking fox. From then on, he had flashes, bits and pieces of memories, but nothing concrete. He looked around him and found himself in the sitting room of Tsunami and Tazuna's home. He saw Sasuke and his teacher Kakashi laid down around him, the older man snoring away in his sleep. He reached over to shake one of them awake, but had his hand stopped by another, gripping his wrist in an assertive, but not overly forceful way. You shouldn't disturb them, they need their rest. Naruto looked over towards the voice, and found the same boy. Naruto had to remind himself, he's a boy, that he'd met in the woods a few days back. He was dressed a bit differently, gone was the pink dress of before, replaced by a green coat. A green coat that looked suspiciously familiar. Hey, wait a second! Naruto shouted out, completely forgetting about being quiet for his friend's sake. You're that guy who attacked us. The boy blushed embarrassedly, rubbing the back of his neck, and mumbling a small apology into the floor. Naruto caught it, just barely, and felt a bit better about the whole thing. He didn't really care that he'd almost died, couldn't really muster the energy to, at the moment. He felt a bit weird, like the itching and clawing that had always been in his stomach was a bit stronger. The beast's presence, for the first time in his life, felt just a bit too strong to ignore. Naruto didn't dwell on that, though. He wasn't much for dwelling at all, and so just like the fact that the boy in front of him, who was currently muttering nervously into the floor, had tried to kill him, Naruto was planning on ignoring the monster inside him as well. It had always worked against the people in the shopping district, after all, so it had to work here, as well. I'm very sorry about that, Naruto. The boy, whose name he was pretty sure was Haku, bowed deeply as he said it, presenting a humbling figure that seemed to war with the silent killer they'd met earlier. That is to say, Mr. Zabuza was dead set on eliminating you all. I tried to go for non-lethal strikes on the two of you, but when you jumped in front of it's fine. The ice ninja blinked once, twice, and then smiled. It seemed to be a happy smile, but there was still a twinge of sadness to it that left Naruto a bit sad. I hope you don't mind me saying this, Naruto. The boy's smile brightened just a bit, and he seemed to laugh a bit as he spoke. But you are a bit odd. Yeah, I know. He smiled back at the boy, before he looked back towards his friends, frowning slightly. What happened to me? A knock at the door broke him out of his thoughts, and he saw Sakura leaning against the wall, smiling at the two of them. She'd clearly heard what he'd said, however, because her expression was a bit strained, a bit tired, like she'd known this was coming, but still didn't want to deal with it. To his surprise, it wasn't just her. Zabuza Momochi, their enemy and a dangerous Jonin-level opponent, stood right behind her, making his way into the room with a careful step. He seemed almost nervous around Naruto, even though the boy knew it wasn't quite that extreme. He was being careful. Whatever it was he'd done, the people around him were taking no chances. I think, the assassin of the mist started, sitting down in the corner of the room, with clear view of the doorway, his student, and Naruto. I'd probably be the best to explain this, in lieu of your sensei's absence. The blonde-haired boy swallowed, sat a bit straighter, and prepared himself. When it was all over, Naruto didn't really know what to feel. So, this black marking on my chest holds the 9 tails? Naruto briefly ran his hand over it. It didn't seem much different from the rest of him, but now that he knew it held a monster inside, it seemed almost cold to the touch. What should I do now? He spoke up, not really sure what else to say. At times like these, it seemed like Sasuke or one of the girls would always have an answer. Right now, Zabuza spoke up, sighing exasperatedly and moving over to his student. Haku here wants to go with you all, and I'm inclined to follow his whims, so we'll be taking your teacher's generous offer to come to the Leaf Village with you. Those two? In the Leaf Village? Naruto wasn't sure how to feel about that. He knew it was just their jobs that had made them enemies, but even still, they tried to murder an innocent man for money. Could they really be trusted so easily? You seem to be doubting Kakashi's decision. The assassin spoke up, chuckling lightly as he said it. Rest assured that he made his choice with no other options available. We know your secret, so we're in extreme danger to Konoha. There are a lot of people who would love to know the identity of the Leaf's Jinchuriki, and some would kill for that kind of information. He swallowed on nothing, trying to remain calm. People will come after me? They'd be after the 9 tails, but even still, he imagined he'd be getting mixed up in an awful lot of those things as well, given that the 9 tails was sealed inside him. He swayed, trying his best to retain his balance. A hand on his shoulder steadied him, and he looked up to see Haku giving him a worried expression. Do not worry, Naruto, we aren't planning on selling your secret. The ice user smiled at him, and Naruto felt a bit of his worries disappear. This boy wasn't the masked man they met on that bridge, at least not inside his heart. He was caring, and nice, even if his words did carry with them a small chill like a snowy day. Well, Haku won't sell you out, so I won't. Zabuza spoke up, grumbling into the floor a second later. Could have made a couple million yen, but whatever, not like it's a big deal or anything. Ah, you're awake! Everyone in the room turned to the sound of the voice, to see Tazuna stood with a bowl of water in one arm, and several washcloths slung across his shoulder. Hey, old man! Good to see you! Naruto shouted back, smiling a bit despite his opinion of the guy. He hadn't particularly liked him, even as they got to know him more, but he definitely hadn't wanted to see the man killed. I just came in to swap the cloths on these guys. The bridge builder walked over to Kakashi and Sasuke, taking the sweaty clothes off of their foreheads and replacing them with new ones. Naruto thought that this was perhaps a bit gross but chose not to comment. Once he had finished, Tazuna turned towards the rest of them and asked, So, what are you all planning on doing? Naruto looked towards the only adult in the room, and Zabuza sighed again, having to relay the same story he'd just given. We're going to travel back with these guys to their village, try and do more than scrape by. We'll probably head out in a day or two once these two recover. He pointed down towards the sleeping duo on Team 7. Well, we owe you all one, so stay as long as you like. Tazuna practically skipped out of the room, guffawing at something Inari said to him on the other side. Naruto himself smiled, seeing that the people who lived in this house, in this country, were recovering. They were talking, laughing, and crying with one another. They were healing through what they'd experienced. Sasuke had often called him perceptive at the worst of times, and he didn't think he'd ever heard something quite so funny when the boy had first told him that. But that perceptiveness was just experience. He'd been around his best friend a lot, and he got used to the sorts of cues that meant that the boy was feeling crappy, or remembering something, or plotting vengeance. It wasn't that hard to spot, honestly. His friend wasn't exactly subtle. Still, he originally got that knowledge from his own experience. He knew what it felt like to be isolated, and alone, and feel like you just wanted everything to be over. He knew how horrible that felt, and he knew that he didn't want anyone, no matter how mean, or terrible, or evil they were, to ever have to feel like that. "All right, Naruto," Sakura spoke up, pointing a finger at him with an assertive expression. "You need to get some rest too. I don't care if your body heals really fast, your mind doesn't." Come on, Sakura," he whined. "I don't wanna." "Get." She practically dragged him into one of the futons set on the ground, pulling up the blanket around him, and sighing. "Honestly, what the hell am I going to do with you all?" Naruto laughed, his face crinkling as he shook lightly in place. He was shocked to find that his body practically melted into his bedding, and he was asleep before he knew what hit him. "Yo, kid!" A startling voice brought him into that headspace, and he found himself ankle-deep in water once more. He sat up, looking with a determined expression at the beast that sat a ways away from him, behind metal bars a meter or more thick. "Nine Tails?" Naruto spoke up, gazing angrily into the piercing red eyes that stared back at him. "Heh, that's right, they told you all about me." The creature laughed again, seemingly finding this very funny. "So, kid, what do you think?" He thought surprisingly little, actually. He didn't really know what to say to an ancient fox demon that tried to annihilate his entire village. Instead, he huffed loudly, turning away from the beast in the cage, ignoring it. The monster's barking laughter made him scowl, and he turned back towards the creature to see it resting its head against the cage floor once again, highly amused. "Ah, man, you really are a kid." The creature's face went serious a second later though, as he seemingly thought out loud. "Still, that other one's a kid too, but those eyes, they remind me of him." Naruto wasn't quite sure what to say, and just when he was about to shout out, he found the creature looking back at him again, face an amused snarl. "Still, I must admit that for a non-Uchiha, that Manjikyu Sharingan had some incredible power." The Nine Tails ran his claw down one of the iron bars, creating a horrid scratching sound that seemed to echo off the walls. "Well, whatever. Congratulations, brat, you seem to have survived my plan to take your body." Naruto felt he'd be forgiven for not thanking the beast in front of him, instead standing on guard, waiting for an attack that didn't come. "Well, you'd best be off, I have things to do, and what not." The monster raised its lips in a cruel imitation of a smile. And a second later he snapped awake. They'd left 2 days later, just enough time for Kakashi to wake up. Naruto hadn't expected his teacher to be so out of it. It had only taken some light bed rest for him to recover from using his Sharingan the first time, but apparently this Manjikyu or whatever it was called was a bit more powerful than Naruto had thought it'd be. They traveled as far as they could before the man had collapsed, asking for just a bit of a break. The rest of them weren't having it, and Zabuza resigned to carry the man the rest of the way. His brute strength from wielding his massive sword seemed to come in extra handy, because he carried the man with no difficulty at all. By the time they made it back to the Leaf Village a few days later, they were all of them a bit exhausted. Not the least of which was Sasuke, who was still recovering from overusing his eyes, but found himself not wanting to slow their formation down. Naruto could relate to that, even if he did wish his friend would be a little more forthcoming with how he was feeling. The guards at the gate were understandably worried about their new arrivals, but Zabuza simply told them to get an Umbu guard for them if they were so worried, and the 2 people who watched the gate agreed, calling in support. A while later, for Umbu, wearing masks of different animals, descended upon them, literally melting out of the shadows. Naruto himself felt a bit nervous, but the assassin of the mist didn't even flinch, instead merely handing his broken blade to one of the masked ninja, who took it without saying anything. He kept his ninja tools, but none of them seemed to mind. Their trip to the Hokage's office was a quiet one, without interruption. Kakashi and Sasuke had both come as well, though not without Sakura's resistance, telling them time and time again that just her and Naruto would be fine, and that they should get some rest. Well, Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage and veritable god of shinobi, spoke quietly, eyebrows a bit raised as he took a long draw out of his pipe. I can't say that this was what I expected. This is an outrage. Another older man, with black, unkempt hair and bandages covering the right half of his face, spoke out, stamping his cane onto the ground. To bring an enemy infiltrator into the heart of this village. Calm yourself, Danzo. The third Hokage was somehow still smiling despite those accusations, looking just as crafty in Naruto's eyes as the nine-tailed fox itself. We should hear what they have to say before we make any wild claims, shouldn't we? Wild claims. Now, what is it that brought you two into our village? If I'm not mistaken, you are Zabuza Momochi, rogue ninja of the Mist Village. The old man took another draw of his pipe, and Naruto started to think that he was doing it just to worry them all. For what reason, exactly, are you requesting sanctuary in our village, and for what reason should we offer it to you? A simple set of questions, and ones that carried massive weight behind them. Answer wrong, and it was possible that the two in front of him, people that he'd actually grown to like quite a lot in the last few days, would be hunted down and killed by his own village. As for the reason behind my request, I simply wish to stop scraping the bottom of the barrel for missions and money. Zabuza spoke calmly, and if it was forced, Naruto couldn't tell at all. I also wish for a much safer environment for my pupil. Haku sat a little bit straighter, not nearly as calm as his master was. That really wasn't his fault. Normally the third Hokage had this air about him that could calm you down, but the man sat beside him, grinding his teeth angrily and glaring at them all, kind of cancelled that out. Despite this, Naruto thought he caught a faint smile on the old man's face, as he looked back and forth between Zabuza and Haku. He clearly saw that which the assassin of the mist tried to hide, his affection for the boy sat beside him. Well, you've answered one of my friend's questions, the other man, Danzo, spoke up, looking down at the duo with terrible disdain. But why should we allow you into our village? What do you have to offer? There are 3 things I have to offer. The first is our silence. We have seen firsthand the power of the Jinchuriki of the Leaf Village, both of the older men in the room stilled. And we would like to keep his secret safe. Secondly, I am a senior ninja, with skills beyond many others in this business, and I am also a defector from one of your most famous enemies. Meaning? Danzo spoke, eyeing the man suspiciously, but looking at him with a small grain of curiosity, and dare Naruto say it. Greed. Meaning that, thirdly, I have information on the Mist Village, tactical information, personnel information, and I also carry with me the Executioner's Blade, one of the 7 blades of the Mist Village. The old men's eyes widened, and they looked towards each other. They shared with themselves a private conversation, with small gestures and looks. A moment later, they turned towards the 2 newcomers, before the third Hokage smiled. We would accept your proposal, provided that you immediately share this information with us. That would work. Zabuza bowed slightly, clearly trying a bit to butter up the third Hokage, and Danzo. Both of them caught it, but chose to either ignore it, or were fine with it entirely. Then if you would, these 4 will escort you to the intelligence core. I will not ask you to divulge everything today, as I imagine that would take quite some time, but we will be having you meet with them a few times a week, until you have exhausted your information. Danzo spoke assertively, standing with some effort, and cracking his cane onto the ground once more. Instantly, 4 ninja appeared beside him, kneeling on one leg. They stood, turned towards the assassin of the mist, and gestured for the man to follow. All 5 of them disappeared with a flash a second later. I would ask you, Team 7, to please escort this boy, along with these 2, Lord Third pointed to Haku, along with Kakashi and Sasuke, to the Leaf's hospital. All 3 of you carry hefty wounds, even if some of you are trying desperately to hide that fact from me. Their teacher coughed into his hand, and the old man smiled amusedly, before making to stand as well, effectively dismissing them all. They left in a hurry, Naruto especially. Something within him, primal, but not the beast in his chest, told him to get as far away from that man, Danzo, as he could. He was not to be trusted. Hiruzen chuckled lightly as the door to his office closed, and he was left in silence with his old friend. It seems those kids are quite afraid of you. Fear of the unknown will do them will, it will ground them. Danzo turned towards him, eyes narrowed in slight annoyance. It would do you well, too, old friend. Oh? You seem to be fine with taking those two in once they offered information. Yes, once they offered information, I was fine with taking it from them, but I still believe that once we have it, we should eliminate them. Danzo stepped towards the door, making slow, confident strides, despite his age. It is always best to deal with a potential threat before it can become one. It is best to deal with a threat once it has become one. Hiruzen spoke. Never before. His old friend gave a dry laugh, with no mirth to it. You trust far too easily. You do not trust enough. The man in front of him turned back to him, an apathetic expression all that remained on his features. We have had this conversation far too many times. I do not wish to repeat the past over and over again. Then perhaps you would do well to say something new one of these times. Hiruzen smiled as he said it, knowing it would annoy the old codger. No, Hiruzen. Danzo spoke. If I said something new, then you would not have someone to contest your idealistic viewpoint. You'd run off with your little utopian mindset and get every one of us killed. Danzo turned fully to face him, his single exposed eye reflecting the evening sun behind them. It is important that the both of us exist. You must operate in the light, and I in the shadow. That is how it must be, how it must always be. Hiruzen guffawed, practically dropping his pipe. It mustn't always be this way, my friend. He spoke a bit louder than he normally would, passion worming its way into his voice. A time will come when we are long gone from this world, and this village will still stand, prouder than it did when we ruled it. Danzo did not speak again, merely sighing, walking out of the door. As he was about to shut it completely, he seemed to remember something a second later, and turned back around. Have you gotten into contact with Jiraiya? Hiruzen smiled, laughing a bit as he thought of his best and worst student. Yes, he spoke up, eyes glinting once more in the evening sun. He's on his way. Chapter 10. The trip back to the Leaf, and the subsequent talks with the Hokage and his advisor were a bit of a blur for Sasuke. Saying he'd been tired would have been an understatement. He'd figured out the hard way that even an Uchiha could overuse the sharingan if they were unfamiliar with its power. Still, Sasuke thought to himself as he sat in his bed at the hospital, I figured out that I can use genjutsu. He'd had a feeling he'd be able to. From what his father had told him, the Uchiha had always had a bit of a specialization in genjutsu, largely due to the sharingan's power. His brother had also been a genjutsu prodigy, though that wasn't saying much. That bastard had been a prodigy in just about everything he tried. Feeling a bit of bitterness seep into his thoughts, Sasuke instead focused in on the ceiling tiles, going through the motions of counting them again. He'd already done this 10 or so times by now, but it was probably the only thing to do in this place at all. I'll have to make sure I don't end up here again. And wasn't that an odd thought? Shouldn't it have been Naruto sitting in this bed, while Team 7 all worried and fretted about him? The boy had nearly died, for a moment there, if what Kakashi said was true. That masked teen, Haku, had killed his best friend. His hand balled into a fist, crinkling the scratchy hospital sheets in his hands. The door cracked open a moment later, and the sounds of frantic whispering filled his head. It was enough to draw him out of his thoughts, and he looked towards the door to see a mop of blonde hair trying to push its way into his room. Another head, one with pink hair and a red bow, tried to stop him from entering. I told you, you idiot, he needs his rest. Oh come on, all he's done for the last 3 days is rest. What he needs now. There were some brief sounds of struggling, before the door launched open, and Naruto vaulted himself into the room. Is some good old-fashioned fun. You are insufferable. Sakura sighed, looking towards Sasuke, and waving at him when she saw he was awake. Hey guys. Despite himself, the black-haired boy smiled when he looked towards the two of them. It had been 3 days since he'd seen them, and he could undoubtedly say he missed them. Hey. Yo. So, what are you guys doing here? Isn't it obvious? Naruto smiled mischievously, laughing under his breath. We're busting you out of here. Wait, what? We are not. Sakura sighed out, resting her head in her hands with a pained groan. "We just came to check in on you, since we figured you'd be pretty bored." "Oh, that makes more sense." "Well, I won't deny that." Sasuke chuckled slightly, before looking at Naruto with interest. "Naruto, why aren't you in here too? Didn't you suffer any injuries in the battle?" The boy rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, laughing nervously all the while. "Well, apparently when I passed out after the fight, I was hurt all over, but once I woke up, all my cuts and stuff had pretty much healed." So, Sasuke thought, rubbing his chin with one hand, it is the Nine Tails. "But isn't that cool?" Naruto shouted, smiling brightly as he looked between the two of them. "I mean, I healed all over in just a few hours. I might be like some kind of super soldier." Sasuke thought that the boy in front of him had put 2 and 2 together and gotten 8, but chose not to burst his bubble just yet. "Could you guys keep it down over there? Some of us are trying to sleep." An older voice sounded off from their right, and they all turned to see Zabuza Momochi, bandages running halfway along his upper arm. Thinking back, Sasuke remembered that the nurses had said it was normal for similarly injured comrades, those who came back from missions in the same general condition, to share a room together, as it often kept the stress levels of all involved down. He was fairly sure she didn't know that the man she was talking about was a world-renowned assassin, famous as the Demon of the Mist, but he hadn't felt like commenting about it then, so he'd ended up with Zabuza as his roommate. It hadn't been the worst thing ever, but it hadn't been particularly fun either. One reason was that damn masked boy Haku wouldn't stop checking in on him, and Sasuke had to keep seeing him, had to keep being reminded of his failures. And maybe it wasn't his fault, and maybe the boy was actually really nice, and had apologized several times more than was strictly necessary. That didn't mean he would forgive him, or that he felt any better about the fight. If one could even call it that. They'd been trounced, with barely any room for counterattack at all. They had come up with one singular plan the entire battle, and even it was defeated only a few minutes later. Just thinking about it had Sasuke grinding his teeth together, twisting his fists further into the sheets of his bed. He could still feel that small helplessness, like their lives were in someone else's hands, like they had no options at all. He had decided all that time ago, when his brother had killed his entire clan, that he never wanted to feel like that again. A hand on his shoulder had him looking up, and it was to find the worried face of his teammate, Sakura, gazing down at him. He nodded back at her. He was fine, really, and he knew, pragmatically, that he was being a bit childish about all of this. It didn't stop him from feeling a bit angry, though. Especially when that same boy from his thoughts walked into the room a second later, holding a bouquet of what looked to be hand-picked flowers. Gone was the green haori of before, which had been damaged by his own kunai when he stabbed it into the boy's stomach, replaced now by a pink kimono. In Sasuke's opinion, it made the boy look even more like a young woman, but he kept such thoughts to himself. "Zabuza, sir, I've come to check in on you." Haku spoke evenly, though to him it sounded forced out, his eyes never once straying to his right, where the three of them stood quietly. "Yeah, brat, I know," the assassin sighed out, looking towards his student with a tender expression, but also one that held clear annoyance. "You've been saying that as you visited me every 3 hours for the past 3 days. Every single time bringing new flowers. I told you, I'm already healed, they're just doing some final checkups." The boy coughed, looking down at the floor. It didn't stop him from walking over and replacing the man's old flowers with the new ones, nor did it stop him from immediately starting to ask the man if he'd had any pains or if anything new was happening. Sasuke had to suppress a small laugh, as it bubbled up from his chest and threatened to spill out. It was a cute display, anyone could agree with that. Sasuke. Naruto spoke quietly, which was the first signal that something was either very wrong, or the boy was trying his absolute hardest to be serious. "Can you walk yet?" "I can, but they say I can't." Sasuke grumbled, gazing down at his hands as they crumpled the sheet between them, before he looked back up towards his friend. "Did you want to talk?" Naruto squirmed a bit but nodded silently. Even the Mist Duo, who had been ignoring their conversation thus far, seemed to hear them. "Hey Haku!" Sakura shouted out, smiling slightly as the boy turned towards her with a dumbfounded expression. Where did you get those flowers? These? The boy pointed towards the vase, and when the girl nodded, he continued. I picked them outside, from the garden in front of the hospital. Oh, the pink-haired girl's smile became just a bit forced. That's, not entirely allowed. Haku went pale white, before bowing fully. My sincerest apologies, I had no idea that. It's no problem, no problem. Sakura spoke out, before she turned towards Zabuza. Tell you what, since you won't be able to pick any more of the flowers out front, why don't I take you two to somewhere they sell flowers instead? Sasuke realized what she was doing a second later, smiling subtly. Thanks, Sakura. The assassin of the mist caught onto it as well, sighing slightly, before pulling his legs to the side of the bed and stepping off. He stood a second later, though Haku looked to be trying to support him, even if the man didn't need it. That sounds like a good plan to me. What about you, brat? The boy in question looked a bit confused but nodded a second later. That sounds good, Zabuza sir. The man turned back towards Sakura. Lead the way, girl. Will do. Sakura smiled, looking back towards the two of them and nodding, perhaps just a bit sadly, as she marched out of the room with her entourage in tow. It took a few seconds for the silence to fade, as Sasuke finally worked up the courage to say something. So, nice, Sasuke, really nice. Naruto, it seemed, was also having some issues coming up with what to say. Sasuke sighed, realizing that it was probably best to trigger the paper bomb directly, rather than dance around it their entire conversation. You died. Naruto coughed, briefly choking on air, before he brought himself back under control, looking towards Sasuke a bit oddly. I really didn't think you'd come out and say that. Honestly? Neither did I. He admitted, sitting up in his bed and leaning back against the wall behind him. But one of us had to. Yeah, I guess. Another bout of silence, but this one was much more short-lived. I spoke to it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran down his spine. He looked up at his friend, but the boy wasn't meeting his eyes. The nine-tailed fox spoke to me twice, once when I went berserk, I guess, and once after you guys saved me. Naruto shivered slightly, whether out of fear or disgust, or maybe just because the boy was cold, he couldn't tell. It told me that it had a plan for me. I think it's going to keep trying to take over my body. Naruto exhaled with some force, before he looked back up at him, seemingly unafraid. I decided that I'm not going to let that concern me. What? Sasuke practically screamed out, gazing into his friend's eyes for any sign of deceit. He found none. If I just sat and lived my entire life in fear, then if the Nine Tails did manage to take over my body, I wouldn't have done anything at all. Naruto spoke, seeming incredibly proud of himself. So, I just decided to worry about it when it comes up again, but not before then. That's stupid. Asinine. Foolhardy. So like you? Sasuke smirked, snickered slightly, and then gave into his mirth a second later, laughing for quite a while before he could get himself under control. Also, about that stuff I said about being Hokage. Naruto muttered quietly, sitting at the end of his bed, but facing away from him. Don't worry about it. What, Ash? But you seemed so sad, I just wanted to. Naruto seemed to fumble around some words in his head, but whatever he arrived at didn't seem to satisfy the boy. I told you, Naruto, it's fine. He smiled, even if the boy couldn't see it. You were dying, or at least, you thought you were. You probably just said things you didn't mean. Naruto stilled. Even from behind, Sasuke could see the boy's thoughts warring in his head, as he gripped the sheet in his hands. Why, yeah. That must have been it. The boy turned back towards him. The smile he gave was hollow, more so than he'd ever seen it. It felt like if he touched the boy, he'd simply crumble into dust. Naruto? I've gotta go, training and stuff. The boy stood off of the bed, his face a complicated mess of emotions. Sorry about leaving you here all by yourself, I know it must be. The boy stopped as Sasuke grabbed his arm, holding him in place. You will become Hokage. Naruto's face blanched. What are? I said you'll become Hokage. Sasuke seethed, his teeth grinding together as he looked the boy in the eye. Or you'll become a hero, or a house husband, or a painter, or whatever else it is you want to do. The boy in front of him stood stunned, unable to do anything but listen as he practically shouted at him. Whatever it is you want to do, you can do it. Those people in the shopping district, or the ninjas who used to pour things on you, or the kids who'd call you names, you don't need to listen to them. You should ignore them, cast them aside, forget all about them. As far as I'm concerned. Sasuke felt a familiar feeling in the back of his head, and realized with a small shock that his sharingan had swirled into being. They can all go to hell. His breathing was heavy as he released his grip on Naruto's arm, falling back onto his bed with a pain behind his eyes. His friend opened his mouth to speak, but the only noise that escaped him was a small squeak, like he'd lost his voice, but still tried to talk. A few seconds later, the boy turned around and made for the door. He stopped short, his hand resting along the frame, running up it in silent contemplation. I want to. It was a quiet voice, and it didn't carry well in the small room, but Sasuke heard it. Want to what? Naruto looked back towards him, smiling a bit sadly. I want to become Hokage. And with that, his friend walked out, and Sasuke was left alone. His confidence, screaming out that he would become Hokage, seemed missing, instead replaced by a desire. He didn't know if he could anymore. Perhaps he'd always been faking it, a false bravado, for his own sake. But for Sasuke, just the knowledge that he still wanted it, still sought after his goal, was enough. It meant he could seek his own, as well. He laid back down, content to try and sleep again, until the nurses released him. And yet, for some reason, it never came. The Leaf Village, Haku decided, was a bit too warm for his liking. Everyone, everywhere, was just a bit too friendly, just a bit too nice, that it almost seemed fake. And maybe it wasn't, maybe everyone here was actually as nice as the performances they put on, but it didn't feel that way to him. Kirigakure was not an overwhelmingly hostile place, not by any stretch of the imagination. Its ninja program could be, of course, and it was for that reason that it had earned its reputation as the Bloody Mist. Still, from what he'd seen, civilian life was much the same as it was here. But the people were colder, more introverted, and Haku honestly thought he liked it better that way. Still, Sakura was nice, that he could say with certainty. The girl was leading he and his master through Konoha, occasionally waving to someone or another in the crowd, or pointing out an interesting landmark to him, or buying him a sickly sugary treat that he had a hard time not instantly devouring. As she walked them into what he could only assume was the flower shop she spoke of earlier, shouting out Ino, he saw the girl behind the counter. She's pretty. It was a fairly blanket statement, and Haku felt it didn't really do the girl justice. She was gorgeous, in the same way that a sunflower was. She seemed to blot out the rest of the world, and as he focused in on her platinum blonde hair and her pale blue eyes, he didn't think he'd ever seen someone quite so beautiful. She walked over towards Sakura, and as the two conversed, he quickly realized that the girls must have known each other. The blonde, whose name he picked up was Ino, smiled and laughed along with many of the things the pink-haired girl said, in a way that seemed familiar to him. He stood a bit too straight as the girl looked over to the two of them, Zabuza standing just a bit behind him. The girl waved at him, giving him a small wink as well, as she walked over, and Haku felt his cheeks might have caught fire. Yo, brat, you alright? His master called from behind him, sounding not too worried. Why yes, sir, I'm fine. He spoke back, taking a small step towards the girls, who looked over at him with a small curiosity. You just look like you're burning up is all. His sensei spoke, not looking down at him, but instead taking a step into the place, grimacing slightly, and remarking, Gods, but I hate places like this. Zabuza, sir. Haku felt the need to defend the shop he'd been in for perhaps 30 or so seconds. Why though? I don't even like it all that much. And we hate you too, sir. The blonde called out, smiling at her own joke. It must have been a good one, because it had the man chuckling for a moment. Alright, fair enough. His sensei gestured towards him, giving him the initiative. This brat here wants to buy a bouquet, and honestly, I don't know a damn thing about him. That's fine, I'm more than adept at handling first-time customers. The girl's voice was overly friendly, and even if Haku knew, deep down, that it was only because she was trying to take their money, it didn't fail to make his heart skip a beat. What is this thing I'm feeling? He realized with horror that the girl in front of him had been waiting for him to say something for at least 5 seconds. Hello? He bowed deeply, before raising back up, his face redder than a tomato. My name is Haku. From off to the side, he thought he could see his master's bemused face. Yes, I know. Ino smiled a bit awkwardly. Sakura just introduced you. Oh. He laughed nervously, trying not to draw out a kunai and kill himself then and there, just to save himself the embarrassment. Did she? Oh my God! Zabuza spoke quietly, but not quite quiet enough for them to unable to hear him. This isn't happening. Yes, but just in case you hadn't heard, I'm Ino Yamanaka. She bowed slightly, clearly trying to rein this conversation back under control. He was perfectly content to allow that, seeing as how he'd been making an ass of himself this whole time. Well, do you have any idea where you'd like to start? Any particular flowers you like the look of, or even just your favorite color? I like sunflowers. I don't like sunflowers at all. What is happening? Over on the side of the shop, he could see Zabuza's head fall into his hands, and heard him mutter something that sounded vaguely like puberty. Well, whatever the hell this puberty thing was, it didn't seem to be helping him much at all. Kakashi sat silently, rereading for perhaps the 1000th time his favorite book in the Ika Ika franchise. Keio Akakasayai. Or it had been quiet, until a leotard-wearing man came flying in through his open window, spinning dramatically upon landing, and shooting him a thumbs up. Hey Guy. Yo! Guy spoke out as he brought a folding chair out of what might as well have been thin air, setting it down in front of his bed and sitting on it. How've you been? What's with the awkward small talk? Kakashi smiled under his mask, eyeing the man curiously. It's not much like you. My students, well, 2 of them, anyways, have told me I should try to be more approachable recently, so I've been striving to act more normally. Guy brought his hair back with his hand, and the grease in it coated it in a bit of a gross way. How was it? Hey, maybe just you, Kakashi said, feeling a bit bad for the man, but knowing he'd rather have him be honest. You see, that's what my other student, Lee, said, and I quite like him, so I figured I'd give the other's plan a shot, but then just trust Lee's opinion. Anyone who thinks Guy should just be himself is probably not all they're themselves. Maybe I shouldn't say that. That's good. Isn't it? My team's coming along quite nicely. In fact, I think they're more than ready to be able to enter this year's Chunin exams. Yeah. I'd been planning on entering my team as well. What? Guy seemed genuinely shocked, looking at Kakashi a bit differently. Or Kakashi, you've only been training your kids for what, a month or 2? That's not long enough for them to build the skills necessary for the exams, and you know that. Were we given any time? The man in front of him sighed, eyeing him annoyedly. That was different, those times were different. We can afford to properly prepare our students for what they might face now. I think one of the reasons that both of us survived our greatest hardships, Kakashi leaned forward, propping his head up with one arm, is we were thrust into situations we weren't necessarily prepared for and forced to adapt. That's true, and it's also true that many hundreds of hopeful students die every year because they were forced to enter a competition they were unprepared for. Guy squinted at him, seeming a bit annoyed with him. Oh, cool it, Kakashi waved his hand in the air, as if trying to dispel his friend's anger. I can't enter them now, anyways, the nurse says I'm going to be in the hospital for the next 3 weeks. The Chunin exams start up in only 2, and they need a functioning Jonin sensei to compete. Well that's good. Good that I'm injured? In this case? Guy smirked to show he was kidding around. Yes. Kakashi laughed at the small joke. Nice to know you think so well of me. Still, were your students really that good? Guy leaned back in his seat, his arms hanging off of the sides. He couldn't help but notice that even now, the man was curling a small set of dumbbells behind the chair. They're strong, and they have some serious potential. Define serious? I'm talking old school serious. Naruto's do you know about? Your students at Jinchuriki, yeah, I know about it. Guy smiled, though it was a bit forced. It'd be hard not to, seeing as it was the only thing half the people in the village would talk about a few months back. They actually made the nine-tailed brat a ninja, and stuff like that. Well, there's also the last Uchiha, and then Sakura herself, who probably had the least potential on paper, soaks up new jutsu like a sponge. I've already taught her how to do the mud wall, and how to tree climb and water walk. Hell, she nailed tree climbing on her first attempt. Guy chuckled a bit to himself, smiling in an almost proud way. You sound like a proud parent. Yeah, laugh it up. No, I'm serious. Guy leaned forward, setting the dumbbells aside. I'm happy for you. I'm glad you've been able to get back on your feet recently. Kakashi knew what the man was talking about, how he'd been near suicidal in some of his more recent Umbu missions. He hadn't thought it obvious to anyone else, but perhaps taking on missions solo, tasks that should have been handled by large groups, was a bit too conspicuous. Ah, yeah? He wasn't quite sure how to respond, and instead elected to sitting silently for the man in front of him to speak again. Luckily, when it came to Guy, you often didn't have to wait long. Unfortunately, when it came to Guy, you often didn't have the benefit of social cues. Just, after what happened to Obito, and then Rin and Minato. Guy smiled a bit sadly. I think we all thought we'd lose you sometime or another, that one day you'd go on another one of your crazed missions and you just wouldn't come back. Way to make me feel like an asshole, Guy. I'm not sure if things are all that better, the man continued, standing up off his chair and folding it back up, walking over to the window. Or if they're on the upswing, but know this, my friend. Guy looked back towards him and gave him a toothy grin that seemed to shine, along with another thumbs up. No matter what happens, we've all got your back. Kakashi felt that the words would have had more impact if the man hadn't immediately hurled himself out of a 4-story window, but the laughter still helped to keep his mood up. Everyone. How many of his old classmates were still alive? Kurenai, Asuma, Aoba, Guy. Is that really all? He was fairly sure he was missing one or two. He vaguely remembered Orochimaru, that bastard, having a student who'd been in their class, but couldn't remember if she'd survived the war. Anko, or something? He sighed tiredly. There'd been 32 kids in his class, and only a handful of them were still alive. He was willing to bet a few had retired after the war, choosing a home life as an alternative to warfare, but the rest hadn't been so lucky. He nearly laughed at that. Am I one of the lucky ones? The wound in his heart, the one that was so deep it didn't even hurt, gave a tiny ache. Rin. Minato. Obito. I don't feel all that lucky. Naruto didn't quite know how to feel as he walked around the Leaf Village, nor did he really know where he was going. Well, he knew where he was supposed to be going, but not particularly if he planned on being there. Team 7 minus Kakashi had been called to the Hokage's office in order for him to ask some questions about their mission, in order to corroborate Zabuza's story. That sounded good enough, and also like something he didn't really need to be there for, seeing as how he'd been on a monster-induced rampage the whole time. Naruto? The voice was familiar, but it was one he hadn't heard in quite a while. Iruka-sensei? He turned around to see the form of his old teacher, brightly illuminated by the harsh sunset. Good to see you, Naruto. His former sensei clapped him on the back softly, stepping in to walk alongside him. What have you been up to lately? Oh, you know, missions. That's odd. Iruka smiled wryly. What's odd? You just didn't used to be someone who avoided questions. His teacher gave him a knowing look, and even if he was no longer his teacher, the man's old methods of getting him to talk still seemed to be working. Sensei, Did you know about the nine-tailed fox? His teacher let out a small gasp, before instantly swallowing it, forcing a small smile onto his face. Yes, I did. He felt a flash of hot anger and rounded on the man with a growl. Why didn't you tell me then? What? If you knew, if you'd always known about it, then why the hell didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me? Naruto was aware that some of the people around them were giving him frightened looks, and that a few of the ninja had drawn weapons, but found himself unwilling to care. Why did you just let everyone yell at me, day in and day out, without ever telling me why? Is Sasuke? Is he really the only one who cares about me at all? Naruto shouted out, nearly falling onto the ground, but catching himself before he could. Why is that kid screaming, Mom? Ignore him, dear. Nine-tailed brat's getting uppity. Think we could use that as an excuse to put him down? We'd be doing the village a service. He felt a growing resentment, a feeling he'd kept caged for so long, burning in his throat. A few tears ran down his face, but he didn't much care. He was about to scream out, maybe even turn and run at them, let them see the Nine-Tails' power for themselves, when Iruka put his hand on Naruto's shoulder. Hey, Naruto? What? Could I treat you to some ramen? It was an innocent question, filled with no real emotion, other than perhaps a small sadness, a small feeling of loss, but he still looked up into his teacher's face. The man wore an expression that shouted calm, which of course meant he was anything but. His brow was drawn down into a scowl, as much as he tried to hide it. The man was clearly as angry as he was, perhaps more so in a way. Seeing the man above him look at him like that, Naruto couldn't quite describe it, but it made the feeling in his throat, that tightness, increase even more. He felt exhausted and worn out, but he couldn't help the small tears that ran down his face as he collapsed onto the ground. I'm sorry. You don't have to be sorry, Naruto, I understand. I'm sorry I yelled at you, and... Then I accept your apology. His teacher offered him a hand, and Naruto took it a moment later, drying his eyes with his sleeve. Now, really this time, could I treat you to some ramen? Naruto smiled, and even if he didn't feel like he was all there yet, he couldn't help but feel a bit happier as he accepted his teacher's offer, and the two walked towards Ichiraku side by side. I want to be Hokage. Those had been his own words, his own real confidence, and not the usual bravado he spouted. Perhaps, realistically, he had a very small chance of becoming the Hokage. But to hell with realism, it hadn't gotten him very far at all, because it turned out he had a giant demon fox sealed inside his stomach. So who said he couldn't become the Hokage too? Oh, just everyone in the village. He ground his teeth together, as his own treacherous mind fed him the dark thoughts he'd been holding back, trying not to sink into them. It didn't do much for him, not until his friend's words practically rang out inside his head. They can all go to hell. He laughed slightly, trying to keep it under wraps, but couldn't quite help it spilling out of him a second or so later, as his calm facade broke down in his seat at Ichiraku. The duo behind the counter gave him an odd look, but still smiled that the boy who'd been a bit sad earlier could now laugh jovially. To hell with them all, eh? That doesn't sound so bad. Who cared what they all thought? They'd be proven wrong anyways, so why did it matter? And maybe, if that niggling doubt still held in the back of his mind, then that was fine too. He'd prove himself wrong, as well. He'd keep up the facade, like he always had, as long as he had to. He'd be the Hokage. He'd be the best damn Hokage this world had ever seen. And don't any of you ever forget it.